Should we start or should we wait a couple of minutes more, Shafat?
Let's give it, I think people are still joining, so let's give it 1 minute maybe.
Okay.
And then, yeah. So I'm sorry I missed that. Pablo, you were fine with questions in the middle, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So good morning, everyone in Malaysia. Good evening in DC. Today at the Kuala Lumpur Research Seminar, we have the honor to have Pablo Ottonello, who is assistant professor at the University of Michigan, presenting the paper Fiscal Stimulus under Sovereign Risk. So feel free to ask questions, and Pablo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Agustin, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. And this is joint work with Javier Bianchi and Ignacio Presno. So the motivation from this paper comes from comparing the conventional views regarding fiscal policies with which countries do in practice. Okay, so the conventional view of fiscal policy, the textbook Keynesian case, is that fiscal policy should play a key stabilizing role of increasing government spending during downturns to stabilize aggregate demand, especially when monetary policy is constrained. Okay, that would be kind of the textbook Keynesian role for stabilization. However, few governments in practice follow this textbook prescription. We illustrate here with a kind of prototypical case, which is that of European economies during the last crisis. So here we have the case of Greece, Ireland, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. The blue line is the average across all of them. So we see how during the crisis, unemployment was sharply increasing, 10 percentage points on average across all of these countries. And simultaneously, we were observing a contraction of government spending, substantive contraction, generalized across all countries, which is in stark contrast with this textbook prescription that I was speaking about. Those, okay, so our motivation is trying to understand this difference between what our textbook cases tell us and what countries do in practice. And if you want, kind of the angle that we bring to the table is one that is probably very familiar to all of you that work with emerging market economies or with risky economies, and is the case of sovereign spreads. Okay, so we see that during this European crisis, sovereign spreads sharply increased also by 10 percentage points during this crisis. So our main question is whether something of what these countries are doing of contracting government consumption during crisis can have to do with the risk that these countries face. Okay, and more generally, the question that we ask is, what is the optimal fiscal policies that countries should have under sovereign risk? So is it stimulus, as the textbook case for Keynesian stimulus will argue, or is it more austerity, as we observe in practice? Can we reconcile what we see during this crisis as an optimizing behavior, but under which countries are experiencing an increase in sovereign risk? Okay, so what we do to answer these questions, so I'll proceed mainly in two main steps. The first step is going to be to analyze empirical evidence on what is fiscal dynamics during recessions. Okay, so we want to understand what countries do in practice, and what countries do has to do with their risk that they have, the indebtedness that they bring to the economy. And our main finding here is that high risk and indebted countries exhibit fiscal austerity. So at least in practice, we do observe that countries that arrive to a recession with a substantive amounts of risk and with high debt positions exhibit fiscal austerity aligned with the kind of the example that we were analyzing for the case of Europe. Okay, then motivated by this evidence, we're going to construct a model of optimal government spending policy, which has two competing forces, if you want. So it has cash and demand channels that will create a benefit for the government to try to increase spending during downturns and stabilize demand, but it also helps sovereign risk. It will the model will embed the fact that if the government wants to increase its spending, it will have to finance it with some debt, and it lacks commitment to repay that debt. So increasing government spending will come at a cost at increasing the risk position of the country. We will find that under this environment, the optimal fiscal policy is overall pro-cyclical, fairly aligned with what we see in the data, okay? And this is in spite of having in the model strong Keynesian channels as measured by large fiscal multipliers, okay? So even in an economy, we're going to deliberately construct an economy that has all the Keynesian channels at play. We're going to show that even in that environment, governments optimally are much more cautious, especially when they bring high debt positions to downturns. Okay, if that is low, stimulus can be optimal, but if that is high, then governments are going to exert much more caution. Okay, and kind of the main takeaway of the paper is that commitment and debt play a key role in the design of fiscal stimulus. So I'm going to discuss at the end potential solutions that countries can find, but those solutions have to do with enhancing the ability of countries to commit, which is the root problem that we observe according to our study. Okay. Some words kind of from the literature, just to put the paper into perspective. There are kind of two main blocks that we are building on. So one is the literature on fiscal policy and multipliers has been a very rich literature. So, you know, it's hard to name all the work, all the very good work that has been done in this area. So what we are adding to this is the debt side and how stimulus, even though can be beneficial from the perspective of stabilizing demand, it can also fuel debt crisis. The other building block, of course, is that of sovereign default. These are models in the tradition of Eaton Gersowitz, Arellano, Aguiar, and Gopinath. And these models have so far mainly abstracted from these Keynesian forces. So they have been today mainly not being focused on the role of macroeconomic stabilization of fiscal policy. Okay, but we are building on both of these important parts of the literature, and in our analysis, we're going to incorporate both. Okay. Any question before I get started with the empirical analysis, or I can also start showing you the facts?
I have a question.
Yes, please.
So would you be, so when in the data, I think there is some differences sometimes, the way these spendings and expenditure are differently mentioned. So some of these programs that governments bring in may fall under expenditure, which is it's like a superset of government spending overall. So would you be making a distinction in that going forward?
Good point. We are mainly going to be focused on government consumption, which is what we are going to be having in the model. And we're going to be doing that both in the data and in the model. Having said that, I would agree with you that there could be other parts of spending, such as investment, that can have like a different set of conclusions. We're currently working on a new separate work. So I'll next time that we if I get a chance to, that we get a chance to talk again, I'll hopefully have more to say about that. The reason why we focus on government consumption, if you want, is that is the prototypical Keynesian stimulus. We have a lot of data on fiscal stimulus, what are the fiscal multipliers, so on and so forth. So although we are abstracting from those elements, I think that a lot of the fiscal discussion has indeed to do with this component that we're going to be focusing.
I see. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll start with the empirical facts. So our empirical analysis is going to build on a panel of around 100 countries around the world for the period from 1980 to 2016. The analysis is going to be based on national accounting data, from which we will measure GDP and government consumption coming from WDI, the right place to advertise this part of the data, and I'm going to be also using WIO, so the results that we measure also valid for WIO. Okay, real GDP, real government consumption. So with this data set, we construct we will construct an event study of recession episodes. So recession episodes are defined with an algorithm that we did in joint work with Pablo and Coricelli, which consists on measuring periods of output contraction and their recovery. Okay, so roughly speaking, with annual data, you identify the episodes of output contraction, and then you analyze when does GDP per capita recovers its pre-crisis level. That's what defines a recession window. Okay. With this algorithm, we identified 570 roughly recession episodes. Then we want to add to the analysis sovereign risk, and we measure this sovereign risk two ways. One is with credit ratings, measured from Standard & Poor's, and the other is with historical default rates from the data set of Reinhardt and Rogoff that has historical data for most of the countries in our sample. So we are going to be, the results that I'll show you are robust to both of these type of measures. Then in terms of indebtedness, we're going to be measuring net foreign liabilities from the Milesi, Ferretti, and Lane data set. And then we include in the analysis country level institutional variables that have been identified as other drivers of procyclicality of countries. So in particular, we include income per capita to acknowledge the fact that rich income countries tend to be less procyclical than developing economies. We include indicators of corruption. We include indicators of ethnic fragmentation and rent from commodities. Okay, all of these are, if you want, insights that we have from existing literature that explain fiscal procyclicality, that we just want to make sure that our analysis is not driven by these other country characteristics that happen to be correlated with default risk. Okay. Okay. Then with this data, we provide descriptive evidence on output and government consumption dynamics during recessions for countries with different sovereign risk and debt. Okay, in particular, we consider the following empirical model. We estimate Jordan style of local projections. So on the left-hand side, we have cumulative changes of any variable of interest, which could be GDP or real government consumption between period T-1 and T+H. Okay, so we are going to be analyzing cumulative changes of GDP or government consumption. Then on the left-hand side, we have country fixed effects. We have then our first coefficient of interest is an indicator for the country experiencing the beginning of a recession in period T. This is a dummy variable that takes the value of 1 if the country is entering a recession in period T, 0 otherwise. Then we have the second coefficient of interest here is the interaction between this dummy variable of a recession and the measure of risk. So the risk is also going to be a discrete variable that takes the value of 1 is the country is risky, 0 otherwise. So we measure risk in these two ways. Like 1, if the country, for example, ever had a rating below A, we're going to call that a risky country. Or if the country has a probability of default, a historical probability of default above 1%, we're going to also call that a risky country. Okay, but the findings are also robust to analysis around those thresholds. Okay, and then finally, we also interact the recession interacted with risk also is interacted with the debt with which the country, the net foreign liabilities with which the country arrives to a recession episodes. Okay, so this coefficient tells us whether the behavior of GDP and government consumption is different for countries that are risky. This coefficient of interest tells us if the interactive effect of risk is different for countries that arrive with a lot of debt or countries with low debt levels. We also include the controls that I mentioned before, and also, of course, the level of debt and the level of risk itself. Okay, now I'm going to be showing you the dynamics of our variables of interest during recession episodes. The first that I want to show you is for the low risk countries in our sample. So we see that they experience, and in particular, we can analyze this with this coefficient here, which is this beta associated with the recession. On the left panel, we have output. On the right panel, we have government consumption. The horizontal axis measures years from recessions, and on the vertical axis, we have this coefficient of interest beta. Okay, so the way of interpreting this is how does the dynamic of GDP looks like on impact in the recession, and H years measured here on the horizontal axis after a recession. 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years after a recession. So we see that on average, all of these countries experience persistent cumulative declines in GDP. After the third year, they start recovering. And on average, low-risk countries do tend to exhibit, on average, increases in their government consumption. Okay, so to that extent, I mean that is varies across countries, as reflected in the fact that the standard errors of the government consumption is not particularly tight. But what it does tell us is that on average, these countries exhibit something closer to the textbook case of trying to increase government consumption during downturns. What about?
I have a question. Yes. Stephen Pettings from Washington, calling from Washington.
Hi, Stephen.
So these are low-risk countries, right? In
yes.
Your previous slide. Mm-hmm. So they're mostly, and low risk is they've never been rated below A. So they're mostly OECD countries.
Correct.
So this is a recession that even 4 years after the recession started, GDP is still 3% below its previous trend.
Correct.
So that's is it below its previous level or below its previous
below
trend?
Its previous level, below its previous level, because it's a small indifference.
So that's a very, I mean, there's not a lot of recessions that sort of come to mind that fit that criteria. I mean, maybe the 2008 recession, but I mean, even
then you have, for example, the big five banking crisis. You know, Sweden, Japan, a lot of these countries did experience deep recessions. So my first reaction was also aligned with yours. But you know, after you analyze individual cases, you do have a number of cases that don't recover as fast. I mean, I also had in mind kind of the typical pattern of the U.S. economy, but when you measure it with this metric, it's So you do have some countries like Sweden, for example, in the 90s, Japan. So you do have a lot of these recessions that haven't been so fast to recover.
Okay, so a lot of it is about the sort of definition of recession. So your pre-screening
Yeah, I mean
mechanism.
that's a good point. So, for
You've
example,
kind of you've kind of
some mild
chosen
recessions.
deep recessions.
Well, we are not focusing particularly on deep recessions, but what the point that I thought you're mentioning is that our criterion of defining recession is with annual data. So, for example, very mild recessions are sometimes not detected by the algorithm. Like the 2000, depending on the data set that you use in the US, is one crisis that will be very mild from the perspective of an annual data.
Right, I see. So it picks out, I mean, big and persistent recessions. I mean, they have to be reasonably persistent, otherwise they'll be within the year and they won't even be detected, as you say.
Right. If it's
Okay.
just kind of a 2-quarter blip and a already recovered, it wouldn't be picked up there. Yeah.
Okay. I'll let you keep on going.
It's basically a definition based on annual data. It does capture, for example, if you go to the United States, it does capture all the NBR recession episodes. If you go to European data, it captures sort of ECRI recessions. So it just eliminates kind of very mild recession episodes. But you do have all the crises that you have in mind. And in the paper, if you're interested, we have figures of all the single recession episodes that we have in the paper. So if you want, we did an analysis kind of one by one of the countries. And we reassure that it's not something particular of the data. So, to some extent, the crises are mainly more persistent than one would have thought.
So one other question about this government spending, you're mostly interpreting this as discretionary spending, or you're just agnostic? Because a lot of the increases in expenditure during these recessions is going to be transfers, unemployment benefits, and also transfers are the biggest part of expenditure and counter-cyclical policy in recent recessions. So this is maybe interpreted as discretionary stimulus.
So at this stage, I'm not putting a particular interpretation. What I do want to mention is that it's government consumption. But I'm not putting an interpretation. If you want, so what we're collecting here is descriptive evidence on how the dynamics of government consumption looks like during recessions. Then I'm going to have a model in which I'm going to attribute this particular behavior to some discretionary action. At this stage, I'm, if you want, outlining facts. Yep.
Yes, sounds good.
Perfect. Okay, so then what about countries with high risk? Well, countries with high risk exhibit a significantly different behavior in terms of their government spending than low risk countries do. So what we have here on the left panel, we are plotting the coefficient of interest gamma, which measures the interaction between recession and risk for different time horizons. So we see that governments that belong to risky economies exhibit persistent declines in their government consumption vis-a-vis their risk-free counterpart, which tend to be persistent for a long time. And finally, if we are in economies that reach the recession with a high debt position, and this is what we're measuring here with the triple interaction between recession, risk, and debt, we see that fiscal austerity measured by the contraction in government consumption tend to be even more pronounced for countries that arrive to the recession episode with high levels of net foreign positions. Okay, so main takeaway, therefore, a substantively different dynamics of government consumption between risky and risk-free countries, and risky countries exhibit higher fiscal austerity, and that fiscal austerity is larger when the country arrives to a recession with a high debt position. Then we measure these kind of for the whole cycle, not only concentrating in recession episodes. This puts it kind of closer to the literature on procyclicality. So here, what we regress in our panel data is the annual change in government consumption regress on a country fixed effect on GDP, changes in log GDP, the interaction of changes of log GDP with risk, and again, the triple interaction between GDP, risk, and debt. Okay, so the first column shows a result that can be well known to many of you. For example, by the work by Zeki and Beck, for example, that countries tend to exhibit fiscal procyclicality, and the way of interpreting this is that this is a positive coefficient in which downturns tend to be associated with contractions on government consumption, and expansions tend to be associated with increases in government consumption. Now, the second column shows when in this specification we add the dummy variable of risk, and what we see is that we see a higher procyclicality in countries that exhibit high levels of risk, consistent with the analysis of recession. We do not find differential treatment for debt, so the phenomenon of debt seems to be something that occurs during downturns in particular, not necessarily over the whole business cycle. But the main takeaway that I wanted to show you from here is that on average, we observe a higher procyclicality of countries with high risk. These economies tend to exhibit more larger changes in a positive direction when there are changes in GDP. All right? Okay, those are my main takeaways from the empirical analysis. With this, I'm going to bring these to the model analysis. Any question on the empirical analysis before I move on to the model?
Yes, I have one question. So Stephen here again. On the so the controls, are the controls interacted with the recession, or are they just in levels?
Yes, exactly. So we did interact the controls. So we put it one by one if you want. So we interacted, for example, corruption with the recession, ethnicity with the recession, levels of GDP with the recession. And the results are robust to add in all of these controls.
Okay.
Yeah, good point. Thank you. These are, I mean, if you want, these are very correlated with each other. So, it's important, to acknowledge that, most of the high, low risk countries tend to be developed. And so that's a sense in which it's important to interact one by one. But at least what we show is that it's not purely driven by differences in income, purely driven by differences in corruption or ethnic fragmentation. Okay, then I'm going to start the model. So what's the main objective of the model? The idea of the model is to say, can we rationalize what we observe with an optimizing framework in which the government is benevolent but faces some constraints to finance its spending? Okay, so for this, I want to consider a model that is as canonical as possible in most of its elements. So we want to consider a small open economy with trails and non-trail goods. This economy will have a stochastic endowment for trails, in which the law of one price holds, and non-trail goods that are produced using labor. Okay, so if you want, we're starting from canonical small open economy model with trails and non-trail goods. In this economy, we have households that have preferences defined over the lifetime utility from consumption, to which we add some utility from the consumption of the government. Okay, the consumption of private consumption is itself an aggregator, a CES aggregator between trails and non-trail goods. Then the budget constraint of the household. On the left-hand side, we have the uses of income, which are the consumption of the household on trail and on non-trail good. And on the right-hand side, we have the income of the households, which is different if the household is employed or is unemployed. Okay, if I'm going to describe the unemployment model in a little bit, but basically, if the household is employed, it receives again market wage. If the household is not employed, they only receive transfer from the government, profits from the firm, and the endowment of trails. Okay. Okay, so then the one key condition that we obtain from the household. Yes.
So I have a question. So here the public spending is in non-tradable goods, right?
Correct.
Do you have a sense of what happened if you also include I mean, the results change or you don't know?
Yeah, it's an important,
data?
it's a good point, Agustin. So it's something that I'll discuss in more details. So for there to be this powerful Keynesian channel, it is important that households, that government spending is in non-trail good, so it gets to boost demand. So that is something that we are trying to attain the model. By construction, we wanted to have that channel, and that is what we focus on, that consumption in non-trail goods. Okay.
Okay, perfect.
The optimality condition that we obtain from the household, which is pretty key, is that the relative price between trails and non-trail goods is equal to the marginal rate of substitution between trail and non-trail consumption for the household of the private good. Okay, so a standard condition linking the relative price to the relative to the ratio of consumptions between trail and non-trail goods for a household. On the firm side, we are also very simple. We consider a firm that produces non-trail output using labor as input. So this is the static problem for the firm that maximizes period profits. It produces using this production function, which is increasing and concave in hours worked, and they pay these labor the market wage rate value. Okay, so these firms are competitive. They sell the output at this price, which they also take as given. The optimality condition equates the marginal product of labor to the wage, and here you see how there is a connection between that relative price of the household that I was showing you before and the firm labor demand. Right? Perfect. Okay, so that's the small open economy block with trails and non-trail goods. So far, like, we started kind of with as canonical as possible in terms of the small open economy. What is our second block? Our second block is a Keynesian block in which we add to the model wages that are downwardly rigid in domestic currency and a labor market that exhibits rationing unemployment. Okay, so this formulation, if you want, follows Barrow-Grossman, Schmidt-Grohe-Uribe, and the reason why we pick it is because it generates a large Keynesian role and a large role for fiscal policy that we did want to have at play in the model. It generates also realistic fiscal multipliers that are aligned with existing empirical literature. Okay, and also has kind of an attractive feature, which is unemployment, which is one of the main reasons why governments in practice want to implement these policies to begin with. Okay. Now, if I want to give you some more details about this block, we assume that wages are downwardly rigid in nominal terms. What that means is that the nominal wage is bounded from below by some minimum wage W bar. Okay. The fixed exchange rate implies that wages denoted in trail goods cannot be more than a certain minimum wage denoted in the units of trails. And we assume that there is rationing in the labor market, so actual hours work are the minimum between the labor supply that we normalize to 1 and labor demand. Okay, so hours are randomly allocated across households, and a fraction H of hours households work, and a fraction 1 minus H of households do not work and are unemployed. Okay. We assume that there is some unemployment benefit that the government can incur to win, and that unemployment insurance rule has some balanced type of budget. So what the government gives to the employee has to be the same as it charges the employee. So what it gives to unemployed has to be the same that it charges to unemployed. Okay. Then we have taxes and transfers that are set to achieve some constant traction between the consumption of the employed and the consumption of the unemployed. Okay, so this is an insurance that can nest kind of different degrees of insurance. So you can have like an extreme form of this insurance is in one in which the government provides full consumption insurance and they both consume the same, or it can be very imperfect and there is a big gap between what the employed and the unemployed consume. Okay, this is something that, again, we wanted to have like a realistic element into the model and to have this unemployment insurance potentially into the model. Okay, that's the Keynesian block. The main rationale of that Keynesian block is, again, to have some stabilization role for the government and to implement these demand stimulating policies. Then the third and last block is a block of sovereign risk, in which the government borrows from the rest of the world in long-term bonds with promise payments that are not, say, contingent. International investors are risk neutral and competitive, and the government lacks commitment and perceives some cost in the state in which the government defaults. Okay, so the sovereign default block follows the work by Eaton Gersowitz, Arellano, Gargopinath, like a canonical default model. So you see that we have like our three blocks are as canonical as possible, and that is, to try to mostly study this trade-off that the government faces when they face big Keynesian gains and sovereign risk. Okay, so let me give you kind of some more details on the government. The government spends on this good that is non-trailed and that is financed with a constant income tax rate, tau, and with a non-state contingent long-term debt bond issued in the unit of trail. Okay, so when the government repays, it basically has here whatever it spends in the non-trail goods, so that's multiplied by this price PN. Whatever it spends on these transfers, tau, the payments of coupon bonds, which are delta times the amount of coupons B to be repaid, and then it charges a tax rate tau to the income of the private sector. So this includes the income of trail goods and non-trail goods. And then the government gets to issue an issuance denoted by I at the price Q that is going to be priced by foreign investors. In default, the government doesn't have access to financial markets, so they only have to spend whatever they charge, they levy from the private sector from this constant income tax rate. Okay, then the government perceives two costs of default: a temporary exclusion from financial markets and a state-dependent utility loss from default. Again, this is a standard, and both are realistic to match data features. As I was telling you, international investors are risk neutral and competitive, and non-arbitrage between the risk-free bond and government bond gives us the bond price that the government faces, which incorporates the probability that the government is going to be defaulting into the future. Okay?
Sorry, Pablo.
Yes.
Is there any reason why you choose a utility loss instead of income loss, or is it equivalent?
Yes. Thanks for that question. So the main reason is that in a model in which you have trails and non-trail goods, you need to specify kind of to which exact ingredient of output were you going to be shocking in terms of loss. And then that will generate itself some movements, for example, on the exchange rate. So we want it to be as clean as possible in terms of the exchange rate movements, like the real exchange rate movements that in this model play a big role. So put it in the utility function, created realistic movements of spreads, but without affecting, with our choice of form of cost, the real exchange rate. Okay, thanks. Okay, now the government is benevolent and it maximizes households' welfare. Now, what we can show is with this two-agent type of model in which you have employed and unemployed households, and you have this insurance, unemployment insurance scheme, you can represent the utility function as a product of two terms. One term, which is the utility of aggregate consumption of trails and non-trail goods that the aggregate economy consumes, and another term that captures inequality concerns from the government. Okay, so there's a sense in which we engineer the model in which is very intuitive. What happens is like you can think about this model as you would in a representative agent environment, in which you will maximize the welfare of our representative households, and you see the trail and non-trail consumption that households have, and then you need to weight it up by how much inequality do you have, and this inequality is this function H that shifts the utility, the marginal utility to consume for the government. Okay, so higher employment raises welfare for a given aggregate consumption. So you can decompose the utility in these two terms. So as usual in these models, the government reaches its period and chooses whether it wants to default or to repay, and it does so by comparing the lifetime discounted utility that the household will have on their scenario of defaulting and the scenario of repay. So how does the value of repayment look like? And if you want here, I'm going to be writing down the full government problem. So it includes this is kind of the most thick slide in terms of showing you the full problem, but it will contain the main trade-off that the government faces. Okay, so the state variables with which the government arrives to the problem are what are the level of endowment and the debt that the economy arrives with, it has this utility flow that, as I was describing to you, has the consumption from the aggregate economy and this inequality consideration. It has the utility from the government consumption and some continuation value. Okay, the constraint that the government faces are three constraints. The first is the resource constraint of the economy that tells you that the economy consumes some tradable goods, repays debt, and that has to be less than or equal than the tradable endowment that the government has, plus the issuance of debt that the government makes. Okay, so this is, in this model, the agent is accessing the international market and transferring this to the household. We also did the extension in which a share of the households directly access foreign markets, and the results are aligned with this. So, this is, if you want, more tractable. The second constraint, it's a very important constraint here, is the government budget constraint. I already showed you that condition before. It tells us that whatever the government spends and pays of debt has to be equal to what the government levies in terms of taxes from the private sector and what the government borrows. And the last constraint is an implementability constraint from the private sector that tells you the government, whatever, can choose an allocation of hours worked, but that needs to satisfy the wage rigidity of the economy, and that it needs to satisfy that the marginal product of labor has to be greater than or equal than the minimum wage that is fixed in this economy due to wage rigidities. Okay, now here I already did a couple of substitutions that are useful. So what I wanted to show you is the following. So where are the parts? So how does the government affect the economy? So the first thing that I want to point out is that in the non-tradable component that I have here, I already imposed market clearing for non-tradable goods. So there exists the classical element that if the government wants to consume more, then the private sector is going to consume less of the non-tradable good. Okay, on the other hand, there are Keynesian channels because the increase in government consumption boosts the price at which firms sell their output and makes firms more willing to hire labor. Okay, so this is the Keynesian channel at place, and it will tell you, well, it's true that the increasing government consumption makes decline private sector consumption all else equal, but if it gets to increase its output, then maybe the private sector can get to consume the same, or there is not so much crowding out. Okay, so those are the Keynesian channels that are at play. On the other hand, we have risk channels at play, which come from the fact that the government needs to finance its government consumption with, the tax rate on income is fixed. So the marginal source of finance for the government spending is this debt. Okay, so whenever the government wants to increase its consumption, it will tighten this constraint, and it will tell you that, it will need to resort to some external financing that potentially has some risk. Okay, so if I want to show you that trade-off that I just described to you of the governments, kind of in one equation, it is as follows. At the optimal, the government will have will be balanced in three terms. One will be the classical Samuelson rule. So what does the Samuelson rule tells us? You know, the marginal utility from consuming the government good has to be equal to the marginal utility of consuming the non-trade good. Okay, because the government crowds out government consumption, private consumption will increase its government spending. Okay, that's kind of will be a Samuelson, and if there will be no Keynesian channels or no risk channels, the government will also be equalizing the marginal utility to consume the public good to that of the private good. Now, what does the stimulus channel tells us? Well, that there is an extra benefit for the government to increase its consumption, and it has to do with how much it boosts that price, the relative price of non-tradable goods, and what is the marginal, the marginal product of labor, how much it boosts production by increasing labor, and that is evaluated at this Lagrange multiplier, which is the Lagrange multiplier on the wage rigidity. Okay, if there is full employment in the economy, there is no slack in the labor market, so there will be no stimulus channel. If the wage rigidity is binding, there is a benefit. This Lagrange multiplier is positive, so there's a benefit of relaxing this constraint. Finally, there is an austerity term, and this austerity term has to do with the fact that the government needs to, whenever they want to increase its consumption, needs to increase its debt, and that debt is going to decline the price of debt, and is going to be making it costly for the government to finance that spending. Okay, so this is the sense in which the government will be balancing out the benefits from stimulus and the cost from austerity. Okay, so if I want to show you what I just told you in a graphical sense, so you know we solve for this problem as I'm going to give you more details kind of in a second, and you know that at the optimal you are maximizing households' welfare, and then if you in all of these figures I'm moving government spending on the horizontal axis, and as the government spends more, it reduces unemployment. But it also increases spreads. Why it increases spreads? Because it's increasing borrowing. All right. Okay. Any question on the model? I'm going to basically after this, I'm going to show you some quantitative results and then conclude.
I have a clarifying question, Pablo.
Yes, please.
So this analysis only apply for fixed exchange regimes, or you can also extend this to an environment with a flexible exchange rate?
Yeah, very good question. So we did extend it to an environment with flexible exchange rate regimes. Like so something that you can do, for example, is think on an inflation targeting type of a regime, for example. So if you think on an inflation targeting regime, it's not that different from a fixed, in the sense of with the fixed you're fixing the depreciation, right? With the inflation targeting, let's say you're targeting inflation. So there is a kind of a bit more of movement of the real exchange rate that will be going on in this regime. But what is important, if you want, is that there is some rigidity at the policy level that cannot completely undo unemployment. Okay, so if you give full flexibility to the monetary authority here, in the environment that I just showed you, the monetary authority can just fully implement unemployment. So for this trade-off to make sense, you need to have some rigidity on the monetary side. And that rigidity on the monetary side is typically, you know, if you have an inflation target, or if you have like a fixed exchange rate regime, like any restriction that you have, like zero lower bound, like any restriction that you have on the monetary side will tell you that this trade-off apply. And we did it for an inflation target, for example, and it's very similar. Okay, so we calibrate our economy for Spain, prototypical case that I was telling you of a economy that faces trade-off in the euro, one of the countries that motivated this. And basically, we parameterize the economy in two steps. So first, we fix a subset of parameters that are standard in the literature, such as risk aversion, intra-temporal elasticity of substitution, technologies of parameter, risk rate, and aggregate shocks. And then we calibrate a subset of parameters such as the discount rate, the utility on government spending, the tax rate, the cost of default, and the wage rigidity, to match key empirical targets that govern the trade-off. These are how indebted the economy is, where the spreads that the country faces, what's the volatility of spreads and government consumption, and the unemployment increase during crisis. Okay, so our economy captures fairly well business cycle statistics of the Spanish economy. In particular, think about this as a laboratory economy in which we find co-movements of GDP, consumption, unemployment spreads that are aligned with the data. Okay, so in particular, we find a counter-cyclical real exchange rate, pro-cyclical consumption, pro-cyclical unemployment, pro-cyclical spreads, and volatilities of these variables that are also aligned with the data. Some of these are targeted, such as the volatility of government spending. Some are untargeted, such as the volatility of private sector consumption. Okay, now, equipped with this, the key question is, what is the optimal government spending that these countries will have? Okay, so in our model, the government optimally chooses a pro-cyclical fiscal policy. Okay, so the correlation of optimal government spending in our economy is 0.72. In the data is 0.46. Okay, so we find a pro-cyclical fiscal policy that is aligned with data counterparts. And this is, in our economy, is mainly driven by the existence of default risk. If we construct an economy completely equivalent, but in which we eliminate default risk, the optimal government spending will be strongly counter-cyclical, coming from fiscal multipliers. Okay, so how can you see this? So think about, for example, in this figure, I'm showing you the endowment of tradable goods on the horizontal axis and government consumption on the vertical axis. So in the risk-free economy, the more you enter into a downturn, the more you want to spend on government consumption to stabilize unemployment. Okay, and this is because of the large fiscal multipliers that we have in this economy. Now, if you are in the economy with default risk, the government initially also follows the lead of the risk-free debt, but at some point, if things continue to decline, the government is going to realize that they face some risk of default and start contracting this government consumption. Okay, so the optimal fiscal policy is highly nonlinear, and it's, you know, depends on how severe the contraction is. And it also, the optimal fiscal policy has a lot to do with the levels of debt with which the economy enters a recession. And the way in which we're doing this is by considering a decline, a negative contraction in the tradable endowment, and we are analyzing what is the effect that this will have on the economy with different levels of debt. Okay, so in the risky economy, if the government enters the economy with low levels of debt, the optimal thing to do is to increase government spending. Okay, so here we have years after the crisis, and here we have the percent deviations of variables from their steady state path. So the government spends more, even a risky economy, if it reaches a crisis with low debt, that economy would optimally choose to spend more. As a consequence of this increase in government spending, there is very little increase in unemployment. Okay, and there is also an increase in spreads, but the government can afford an increase in spreads because they didn't have so much debt to begin with. Now, note what happens if the economy enters with a high debt position. So with a high debt position, the government is very reluctant to increase its debt level. And as a consequence, it contracts government consumption severely. These are the red lines. And you know that spreads are increasing sharply in this case, and the government is trying to decline its debt position. But nevertheless, it has to decline its government spending to avoid a potential sovereign risk crisis and entering into default. So note here that the government is not contributing at all with the crisis in terms of unemployment. So there is a decline in demand in the private sector, and the government also contracts its demand as well. And as a consequence, there is a sharp increase in the unemployment rate in the economy. Okay. We also consider some potential fiscal programs to solve this. We note basically something key to note here is that if a third party, let's say a multilateral institution, for example, will come and, at that point will tell the government, okay, you need to decline your government spending today, that can be potentially precipitate a default and can be counterproductive, because basically the government is being forced towards cutting spending, and that declines the value of how much the government values paying to the rest of the world. So, forcing cutting government spending today can precipitate default in this environment. However, there is the possibility of promising to cut spending into the future. And if you promise to cut payment into the future, and particularly if you engineer it to say, okay, let's make the government to commit to adjust its spending in the future, that can potentially lead to welfare gains and reduce the crisis at the same time. So if you want, kind of what is the main kind of policy solution that could be to this problem? Well, if a third party, such a multilateral institution, comes and provides the government some ability to commit to do something into the future, markets will like that. If it's really the case that the government can commit, they will factor in that into the price that the government faces, and then the government can instead do less austerity today because it faces better prices from markets, and the third party can in principle give a role of commitment to the government into the future. Okay, so to conclude, sovereign risk makes fiscal policy highly procyclical despite of large fiscal multipliers. When that is low, stimulus is optimal, and recessions are likely to be less severe when there is fiscal space, which is consistent with empirical evidence. Okay, in the paper, we also explore these fiscal rules that I was describing to you in more detail, which come from a third party. And the main takeaway is that commitment and indebtedness play a central role in the design of fiscal policies.
Thanks a lot, Pablo, for such a great presentation.
Thank you very much.
Is there any question from the audience? I have a question, Pablo.
Yes, please.
So, to what extent is important this assumption of endowment economy? Because I feel that maybe if you have a production in the tradable sector as well, then you're going to have more gains from this fiscal stimulus, and maybe this trade-off will be different. Have you think about this? I mean, especially in economies.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
We didn't do it in this particular paper, but I've done it in another paper which I have a similar structure, so I can tell you kind of how I see it. So you can obtain very similar results if you are in an economy with production in tradable sector, but in which we have market segmentation. Okay, so the way in which you can think about this tradable endowment assumption is that we want to think in an economy in which there's not a lot of mobility of labor between tradable and non-tradable sector. That is, if you think that the economy will have some changes in the productivity in the tradable sector, okay, that will be enough to generate something very similar to what I showed to you today, as long as you have market segmentations. If you have a lot of labor mobility, then you do have much more potentially bang for the buck of trying to generate to boost employment. But you are, I'll say that the data is a little bit closer to that of market segmentation. For example, the sectoral transitions of employment between a tradable and non-tradable sector in the data have shown to be pretty rare even within crisis. So that's a sense in which I think that's a kind of a reasonable approximation of the data.
Perfect. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
I think we have something in the chat. Let me see.
Oh, sorry, I wasn't seeing the chat. I don't know if you. I
Yeah,
don't know how I can see the chat.
there is one. I mean, I don't know if it's question or comment. So let me read it for you. So it says, I have a different opinion. When one trying to stimulate cities' economy, one should increase government expenditure instead of consumption, which lead to increase in consumption, increase employment, and lower tax rate and tax incentives. Hence, spread economy in the country. No borrowing, no money printing.
Well, I mean, so okay, so that is a good point. So an alternative here would be to change taxes. So that is indeed something that we show. For example, is that if the government will have like a perfect system of taxation, like a move around, the government can achieve full employment. So I agree with that view. So here, if we want, the reason why we are fixing the tax rate is because in the data, that it doesn't change so much over the cycle. So countries have typically a challenge to change substantially taxes during crisis. So we have an extension of the model, for example, where we allow for tax flexibility and parameterize to realistic features, and we obtain similar results to that we're obtaining. If we have enough, so I want to be upfront about that. If you have enough tax flexibility, you can definitely do better off to what I'm describing here. Now, what I'm describing here, note that it does have part of the elements that you have in that suggestion. So if the government increases government spending in this economy, it does increase employment. So the Keynesian multipliers are pretty large. They are around in the upper bound of the empirical literature. So for sure, increasing government consumption is going to increase employment. That also is going to raise revenue. So even with a fixed tax rate, it does raise fiscal revenue, but it does not do it enough. So so here you are not in a situation in which even with large fiscal multipliers, like if your tax rate is constant, you don't have self-financing spending realistically. If we will be in a situation, then that will be also a no-brainer. But what we're saying is that if you want to increase employment through debt, that is risky. And there's something connected that I want to highlight as well. So here is not, so the government is fully benevolent and try to do the best thing for the house. And now what the government is saying is, I can increase today's spending, or if I put my country in a vulnerable position, I will not be able to help employment tomorrow. So, for example, if I increase my debt a lot today, tomorrow the governments that come after me will have zero space in terms of increasing their spending. Okay, so if you want, the government here is between a rock and a hard place. So there are good solutions if you arrive to a crisis with debt. So that is why we are emphasizing so much. If you want to increase government consumption, that we think that there are very good reasons to do it, then it's important to do something with debt or with your ability to commit.
Great, thanks a lot. I think we are running out of time, but Steven has a question for you. So Steven.
Yes, so I just wanted to know two things. One is, so you said the fiscal multipliers are large, but how large is that? And the second point is that the results may be very sensitive to the size of the tax rate. So if you have two countries, one that has a very low tax rate, and one that has a very high tax rate, with the high tax rate country, they can actually self-fund a lot of the stimulus. So they capture back a lot of those benefits. So the borrowing required would be smaller.
Yeah. So okay. So let me start with the second point. So we are definitely it does matter for the conclusions. So what we are considering here is, first of all, we are calibrating tax rate to what we observed in the data, and we did it for several countries and find consistent results with that. So another thing that is important is that, you know, if you are in a situation in which the tax rate is larger, but the government spending is also larger, you are not necessarily in a situation in which it will be that different to the situation that we are considering. So what matters here is how much you rely on debt as a marginal source of financing. And, you know, like a lot of countries have, for example, much more revenues to GDP than others, but many times those countries also have more government spending to GDP than this country. So, you know, as long as you are in a situation in which the marginal source of finance is debt, you can be facing a very similar trade-off to the one that we're showing. But for sure, I mean, I want to be clear that, you know, analyzing idiosyncratic elements of these can be different if you are in one country or another. So what I don't want to kind of give you an impression of kind of a general prescription comes out of this. What we're saying is, look, you can rationalize what you observe in the data with this trade-off. This has a lot to do with the fact that in economies such as Spain, for example, in risky economies, you do have external debt as being a marginal source of finance. But, you know, this trade-off, the resolution of this trade-off does depend quantitatively on specific countries. So, you know, if you want, we want to provide kind of a framework and showing that fits data patterns, but for sure, different countries could have different resolutions of the trade-off. Now, something that we want to also point out is that the initial evidence that we have is that most countries in the data do follow fairly pro-cyclical fiscal policies. So there doesn't seem to be so many countries that are risky at the same time, and then somehow exhibit such a large pattern. Of course, you can say, well, there might be other things going on in other countries, but, you know, at least if you want to have a framework that explains what happens in all of these countries, I think risk has a chance of explaining that. To your question of how large they are, so fiscal multipliers are quite non-linear in our economy because of, for example, the wage regime. So, you know, it matters a lot how close you are to full employment, but it's not unusual that, for example, when the wage regime is binding, we have a fiscal multiplier above 2, for example. So it's very large in that sense. So we are giving all the Keynesian benefits that are aligned with existing areas. So they can be between 2 or 3 in this model, depending on where you are on how much slack you have in the labor market.
I think this will be the end. Thanks a lot, Pablo, for such an interesting talk.
Thank you very much, everyone, for the questions and for inviting me.
Perfect. So this is the end of the talk, and thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
See you, Pablo.
See you.